anyone know what today is?
National Cat Day.
It is National Cat Day. There we go. It is National Cat Day. The biggest holiday of the year in the United States. But when I realized it was National Cat Day, it suddenly occurred to me, is it National Cat Day everywhere? I mean, it's a big deal in the US, but what about elsewhere? Because it's called National Cat Day. And in fact, there is an International Cat Day, which we all celebrated 2 months ago. So I didn't know if it was National Cat Day here in Canada, but fortunately I have Google, and the answer is yes, it is. So happy National Cat Day to everyone, and the celebrations will begin as soon as I'm done speaking. Well, in any case, the topic of my book, or my talk, is about this book I wrote about cats. And as Dolph somewhat alluded, many of my friends and colleagues, I would say most of them, were really surprised when I wrote this book. Because I've spent my entire career studying lizards. And in fact, this interest in lizards started when I was a little boy. Here's me in Florida as a youngster catching lizards. I was fascinated first by dinosaurs, and then I switched over to living reptiles and so on, and it's been lizards ever since. But at the same time that I was becoming fascinated in lizards, I was also falling for cats. This is me as a 5-year-old with our first cat, Tammy. We adopted her from a local shelter in St. Louis. It was a present from my father on his birthday. And 2 years later, we added another rescue Siamese, Marisha, and I've been crazy about cats ever since. Nonetheless, as my scientific career progressed, it never occurred to me to do anything professionally with cats, for 2 reasons. One is, I wanted to go out into nature and study animals as they interacted with the environment, as they went about and did what they do. And anyone who has tried to follow a cat knows just how impossible that is. That as soon as they figure out what you're doing, which is pretty much right away, poof, they're off into the bushes or whatever, and you can't do it. So they didn't seem to be a good organism to study. And moreover, I was under the impression that no one was studying cats. By cats, I mean the domestic cat, Felis catus, not lions and tigers. I just didn't think there was any interesting research going on by anybody. Well, about 12 years ago, I learned that second belief of mine was completely wrong. In fact, there were scientists studying house cats and feral cats using all the same cutting-edge techniques that I and all the great faculty here at UBC study the cats. Genome sequencing, radio tracking, isotope analysis, and all kinds of other studies. And in fact, there was a rich scientific body of work on cats. And then I had what I humbly submit was a brilliant idea. I would teach a class to first-year university students, to freshmen, called The Science of Cats. And the idea is that I would lure them in on their interest in cats, and then teach them how we study biodiversity, just using cats as the example. So I did teach this course, and it was, I think, a great success. It was certainly a lot of fun. I managed to get students up at the crack of dawn to go out to one of the sketchiest parts of Boston, to a colony where people were feeding cats. Actually, I didn't get them up. They stayed up all night, but we got them there before dawn. We went to a cat show and saw all kinds of interesting cats there. We went to an art museum and got a lecture on cats in art, and we did all kinds of other things. And so the class was, I think, a great success, and it wasn't much of a leap to go from that to why not write a book on this. I had just finished the book that Dolph alluded to, and so I wrote this book. And so I want to tell you some of the things that I learned in this book about where cats came from, why they do what they do, and what the future may hold. So let's start with the name of the book and the signature sound that cats make, their meow. Now, I initially thought that, as anyone who's lived with a cat probably has experienced, they meow to us, and presumably they are trying to communicate with us. And I always assumed that they were just welcoming us to the brotherhood of cats, that they were treating us like they do each other. But it turns out that research on outdoor colonies of cats in England has revealed that cats generally don't meow to each other to communicate, at least not very much, except kittens and their mothers. But beyond them, they don't meow to each other. They make plenty of other sounds to communicate, like hissing and snarling and so on, but they don't meow. So meowing to us seems to be a trick that they picked up during the domestication process. And that might suggest that meowing is a very recently evolved trait, and it would indicate that other cat species don't meow. And so I decided to research this question of, do other species meow? And And I researched it, and of course the modern way of doing it, I went to YouTube. So here, for example, is a bobcat. I would contend that's a meow. A little bit deeper because it's a bigger animal, but that cat is meow. But how about this one? This is a serval from Africa. So clearly it's a meow. And in fact, all species of small cats meow. The large cats, the lions and tigers, don't have the structure in their throats. They roar, but they do not meow. But all species of small cats meow. And so what this means is that the domestic cat did not invent the meow. It just invented it as a way of communicating with us. So that leads to some further questions. The first one is has the domestic cat's meow evolved from that of its ancestor? And the second question is variation in the meow meaningful? Well, this was the subject of research by a graduate student at Cornell University named Nicholas Nicastro. And I think you can see by this photograph he sent me, he's a real character. One of the fun things about doing the research for this book is getting the stories of people about how they did their research and why they became cat scientists. And the short story is no one sets out to become a cat scientist. It just kind of happens to them by serendipity. In any case, he studied these questions. The first question is, has the cat's meow changed from its ancestor? Now this is the ancestor of the domestic cat, the African wild cat. I'm going to tell you in a little while how we know that, but take my word for it for the moment. But one thing I think that is important to recognize is that African wildcats are very similar to domestic cats. They have changed very little. And I like to say that if you saw a cat like this walking, if you're on campus and you saw one walking across Westbrook Mall, you wouldn't say, what's an African wildcat doing here on campus? You would say, what a cool looking cat. I've never seen one quite like it before. And in fact, the only way to definitely tell whether you have a house cat or an African wildcat is by the length of its intestines and the size of its brain. And obviously that's of no use if you have a living cat. So they're very similar animals. In any case, Nicastro went out to compare the meow of house cats and African wildcats. And to do that, he traveled to the Pretoria Zoo in South Africa, where they have a large group of African wildcats that they're breeding. And he took a microphone with him, and he recorded their meows. And then what he did was that he played back those recordings to a bunch of volunteers at Cornell. And he didn't tell them what they were listening to. They put on headphones and just asked if they could tell them apart, which they definitely could, because the house cat's meow is higher pitched and shorter than the African wildcats. The house cat's meow is the African wildcat is kind of a deep meow, whereas the domestic cat is kind of meow. And so people could tell this difference, and they much preferred the sound of domestic cats. And so that implies that the domestic cat has evolved changes in its meow and in ways that are appealing to our ears. And in particular, the high frequency sound seems to be a sound that people prefer. So they have changed their meow. But in addition, there's the question of multiple meows. That again, people who have lived with cats, many have experienced that they have different sounding meows that they use in different contexts. And the question is are these differences, are these differences meaningful? Are they trying to tell us something different? Or in some sense, very loosely, is there a cat language where different meows have different meanings? Well, to test that, Nicastro recorded the meows of specific different cats in multiple situations. So what he did is he went to people's houses and he sat down and he recorded the cat's meow in a number of different contexts. One was a content cat, usually sitting in the lap of the person with which the cat lived. Happy cat, and it would meow and he'd record it. Also, they would put a cat in a confined space in a room that it didn't want to be in and close the door and record the meows. A cat that was about to be fed, a cat that was in an unfamiliar space, specifically Nicastro's car, and finally a cat that was being aggravated by brushing it backwards. That turned out to be a little bit dangerous. He got bitten a few times, but those are the things you do. Anyway, the cats did meow differently in different contexts, and there was no question about that. But there was no commonality. It wasn't that all the cats, when they were content, made one meow, and then when they're about to be fed, made a different one. They did vary, but it wasn't the same from cat to cat. And this was confirmed when, again, he played the meows to volunteers wearing headphones and gave them a list of the 5 different ways and say, what do you think's going on with this cat? And people would say, oh, it's in an unfamiliar space. And basically, they were no better than guessing. So if there is meaning, well, so it didn't provide understanding to what was going on. But that understanding was provided subsequently by another researcher, Sarah Ellis in the UK, who did the same study, but she added one twist, and that was the people who listened to the sounds included the person who lived with that cat. And she found in general that most of the people, the same result as the previous study, no better than guessing what was going on. But the person who lived with the cat was very good. About 60% of the time, that person could say, you know, Oliver is not happy that you're brushing him backwards, or Jasmine is a very happy cat. And so what that indicates is that there is a private language that develops between cats and people they live with. And so the different meows are meaningful, but somehow they figure it out between themselves. And how this is done, no one's ever studied, but it would be a fascinating thing to investigate. So they have evolved the capacity to communicate with us. Now let's switch a little bit to the other signature sound that cats make, and that of course is meowing. And again, I'm sorry, I was just talking about meowing. Purring. And we might ask, do other species purr? And here again is the serval. Absolutely, that guy's purring. And again, all small cat species purr, but the large ones don't. There's a asterisk to that statement about mountain lions and cheetahs, but you'll have to ask me about the question session for that. In any case, again, people who live with cats are aware that there are multiple different purring sounds. There's the purr of a cat that's in your lap and you're rubbing the cat, and it makes this very contented purr, purr. They're so soothing to people. But there's a second sound, a sound they make when they want something. Picture you're in the kitchen, you're opening a can of wet food, and your cat is weaving between your legs and making this very loud purr, purr, a very chainsaw-like sound. And they often do it when they want something. Well, another British scientist decided to study the differences between these two purrs, Karen McComb from the University of Sussex. And so she recorded the purrs. First, she recorded the contentment purr, just a happy cat. Here's what it sounds like. Very peaceful. And then here's the solicitation purr. Here's what she calls the solicitation purr. And here's how she recorded this. She found people who fed their cats the very first thing in the morning, as soon as they got out of bed. That is a terrible idea. Cats are very smart. And so she told these people, when your alarm goes off in the morning, stay in bed. And she put a microphone on the bed, and sure enough, within 3 minutes, the cat would jump up on the bed, position itself right next to the person's ear, and start doing the purr, purr. And so she was able to get this purr. And here's what it sounds like. All right. I want to play them to you again just to hear the difference. Contentment purr? Nope. So you can hear the difference. Okay, so then she did a audio-digital analysis of the sounds of these purrs, and she was able to show the difference in the two purrs. This is a graph showing the frequency, how deep or high-pitched the sound is. And you can see that the biggest difference is on the very deep end, where the solicitation purr has this peak that the contentment purr hasn't. And so she said, this is the difference that we can detect. I thought this was a pretty cool study showing that these really are different and so on. But then she said something I had my doubts about. And she said, this peak circled here is at the same frequency, the same spectrum of a human baby crying. And she said that humans, of course, are innately attuned to that sound. It gets our attention. And her suggestion was that cats had evolved to basically hijack our sensory system by creating a sound that we are used to. This is actually, there's a name for it. Some of you know it's called the sensory exploitation hypothesis. Well, I thought that was ridiculous. I mean, that's too much. But then I listened to the solicitation of purr again. Anybody hear a baby crying? Anybody? So raise your hands. Yes, this is typically maybe a third of the audience thinks so. So if you're not so sure, you can find purrs like this on YouTube and just listen for yourself. But at least it's a plausible hypothesis. So, so those are some of the ways that cats interact with us, and that some of these traits may have evolved during domestication. Now, as I pointed out, that in terms of their anatomy, they are barely different from their ancestor, the African wildcat. And that leads to the question, are there any other ways that they have changed? Or are they just basically slightly modified African wildcats? Well, in terms of behavior, we might think of some of the kind of nutty things that domestic cats do, and we might ask, do wildcats do those? Sitting in boxes, chasing laser point dots, going nuts over catnip, kneading or making biscuits, as it's sometimes called, or bringing toys for play. So let's go through them one at a time. First, do other felines sit in boxes? Absolutely. You can find pictures of all kinds of species. You put out a box, the cat is in it. What about chasing laser pointer dots? Well, this is a tiger, obviously. And there he goes. And he's a little more regal, slow-moving than your house cat, but he's definitely chasing after that laser pointer. And there are plenty of examples on YouTube of this. What about catnip? As you probably are aware, there's something about catnip that cats find irresistible. And there's a great story about what that is, but putting that aside, lots, but not all domestic cats really like to rub around, and they seem to go into a trance. And they seem like they're in kind of drug stupor. They start salivating and so on. Well, question answers itself. Basically, all felines have the same effect of catnip. So none of these traits are unique to domestic cats. What about what is called making biscuits or kneading? You're probably aware that the cat on a cushion or maybe on your belly gets into kind of a trance and goes like this for sometimes minutes on end, and then usually curls up and goes to sleep. Now, domestic cats, we know where that comes from to some extent, and that's exactly the behavior that kittens use when they're nursing from mama cat. And they go like this, and it's thought that this may be a way of stimulating the milk flow to make sure they get enough to eat or drink. Do other cat species do this? Doesn't seem to be. There are only a couple reports, and they're not in the scientific literature. It seems that other cats aren't known to do that. Of course, how many cats get the opportunity to do that on their stomach or in some other place? But there is a good chance that this is a behavior that they have basically extended their juvenile behavior into adulthood as a way of perhaps bonding with people. So this may be a behavior that has evolved during domestication to interact with people. Finally, almost the last one on my list is bringing toys to play. And to introduce this idea, I have a video of my cat Nelson. And when Nelson was a kitten, we got him, and he started doing this completely on his own. He would go find one of his toys, and he would walk up to me with it, and he would drop it at my feet and say, "Time to play." And I would pick it up, and I would throw it down that hallway, and he'd go right after it and get it and bring it back, and he would do it for quite a while. I did not train him to do this. He picked it up on his own. Now, when he started doing this, I thought that Nelson must be the greatest cat in the world. And it turns out he is, but maybe not for this reason. But I had these ideas, creating the Nelson YouTube channel, putting him on the Tonight Show, entering him in America's Got Talent, and fame and fortune to follow. But then I said, well, before embarking on this plan, maybe I should make sure that this is truly unknown. And so I did a little Googling, and it turns out lots of cats do this. In fact, there was just a scientific paper that estimated that a quarter of all cats are just like Nelson. So it's sadly not a unique trait of his. Now, I would suggest this might be something that has evolved during the domestication process, but who knows? I've talked to zookeepers, and no one could say, well, yeah, sure, we play with the tiger, he brings his toys all the time. But then how many opportunities are there for them to do that? So we need some more scientific study to see if other cats raised appropriately would do that. That might be an interesting project, but maybe that's a trait that's evolved during domestication. There is, however, one interesting trait that clearly has evolved in the domestic cat, and that has to do with their tail, and particularly to this behavior here, where they stick their tail up in the air. And although this cat has a mean look on his face, he's actually approaching to get some belly rubs. That this is a sign of friendliness. Basically, I come in peace, or I'm a friend. And just to illustrate this, this is another of my cats, Archie, and I'm calling him to me, and he's approaching. And as he gets close to me, up goes the tail, and then he comes and rubs my leg. And so this is well known as a friendly breeding of cats. And this is, well, I'll get to that in a moment. So there was a very clever study that demonstrated, I think pretty conclusively, that this is a friendly gesture. And they took advantage of something that I was not aware of. And that is, if you get a naive cat and you put a silhouette on the wall like this, they will initially think it's a real cat. Now, they quickly learn the ruse, but you can do a quick test on them. And so what the researchers did is they put a silhouette like that on and showed it to some cats. Or they put a silhouette, same silhouette, but the tail down. And what they found is when you do the silhouette with the tail up, the cat would usually approach very quickly and raise its own tail. By contrast, if you put the silhouette with the tail down, they didn't approach nearly as quickly or at all. And when they did, they often didn't raise their tail, and often they just looked at it and put their tail back and forth, which, as you probably know, is a sign of nervousness. And so it seemed to be pretty clear that this is a signal of friendship. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there is no other feline species that does this. Certainly not the African wildcat or any other. So it's clearly something that evolved in domestication. That is to say, there is no other species of cat except one. Would anyone like to guess what the other wild cat species is? Anyone? Come on, throw one out. Ocelot. Serval, no. Ocelot, no. Lion, correct. Lions also do the exact same thing, and seemingly for the same reason, that when members of the pride come together, they do that and they rub up against each other and so on. Now, at first glance, this would seem to be an unlikely pair of species to share such a behavior, so different in size and many other attributes. But in fact, they share one similarity that explains this behavior, and this is probably the most important change that domestic cats have made. It is related to the most important change. And to do that, to tell you about that, we first need to talk about lions very briefly. As you're probably aware, lions live in prides. Now, prides are composed of groups of related females. What happens is that the female cubs they don't generally leave the pride, and so they're sisters and cousins and so on. The males, when they get to be advanced juveniles, they leave, and they go elsewhere. But the females stay together. So there are a bunch of related females, and then there's some males that kind of oversee the pride, but they're transitory. The females stay, and they're extremely friendly to each other. They lie around together like this, they groom each other, they play with each other, they lie with each other, they even nurse each other's cubs. And so they're very friendly to each other. Well, it turns out that the same is true in some circumstances of domestic cats. That when you have domestic cats living in a group, they form into social groups very similar to prides. Now, the first question, though, is why do you have a lot of cats living together? Well, this is in places where there's a lot of food, as often happens in cities where people put out food for the unknown cats living there, or in fishing villages where there are regular supplies of scraps that are thrown out, or on farms. And in those areas, the cats organize them into a social system that is really very similar to prides. To my mind, they should be called prides, because the females, within their group, they're all related females again. They don't leave, so they've grown up together. They lie next to each other, they groom, they play. They not only will they nurse each other's kittens, but they will even assist in childbirth, kitten birth. And so, really, they're the same as lions. And so that explains, it makes sense that they both have evolved the same signal to announce, when they're coming together, I come in peace. And what better part of the anatomy? You can use your ears or your whiskers, but that's hard to see at a distance. You could use your arms and legs, but you got to walk on them. But the tail, you just bring it up and the message is clear. And so I think that explains why we see this trait that has evolved in domestic cats and lions. I will point out that there is one major behavioral difference between the prides of the two species. lions are famous for hunting cooperatively, allowing them to kill prey much larger than they could do on their own. And thankfully, domestic cats don't do this. And just imagine a pack of cats going after a groundhog or a raccoon. So that is one difference. Well, with that, let's flip to the second part of the talk, and that is about the history of cats, past, present, and future. And so we'll start with their past. This is a drawing of the ancestor of modern felines. It is a species called Proilatus lemonensis. It's lived 30 million years ago, and the fossil indicates that it was basically a cat, that its legs were perhaps a little stubbier than most cats, but no question that it was a cat. In fact, so all cats, they found a winning formula and really have changed very little over 30 million years. We don't know how they got to where they are because we don't have any transitional half cats, but the first cat was clearly a cat. Well, for 10 million years, nothing much happened in the cat world. We don't have many fossils, and the few that were found were all the same thing. But then 20 million years ago, there was a major event. The cat lineage split into two groups. And one of those groups were the saber-toothed cats. This is the South American saber-toothed cat, which is the largest feline species ever to have lived on the earth, as far as we know. It weighed close to half a ton. So that is a pretty big predator. A species only slightly smaller lived in North America, Smilodon fatalis. It's particularly well known from the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, and this is actually a painting of what the La Brea tar pits may have looked like. Now the La Brea tar pits are in Los Angeles. They're in the middle of the city today, and they're a spectacular place to visit. You go there and you can see tar still oozing up between the cracks in the sidewalk. But this was only 15,000 years ago. This is what LA 15,000 years ago looked like, with saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, mastodons, and so on. Well, in any case, that was one of the lineage of cats, the saber-tooths, and the other lineage are the cats that led to the ones around today. They're sometimes called the round-toothed cats. Instead of having saber teeth, they just had typical teeth. For much of the evolutionary history of cats, it was the saber-tooths that were dominant in terms of the number of species and the number of fossils you find. And they seem to be the dominant cats, and the ancestors of today's cats were subordinate. And then the saber-toothed cats, of course, went extinct. And the last ones that went extinct, as I mentioned, was about 10,000 years ago. Why they went extinct is not entirely clear. Probably the bigger ones went extinct because we killed off all the prey that they ate, the big mammoths and so on. But why did the littler ones? We don't know. But I'd like to ask, what if it had gone the other way around? What if the round-toothed cats had gone extinct and the saber-tooths had survived? Well, I would like to think that we would be sharing our homes with fish. I think that someday someone needs to create a saber-toothed house cat. But in any case, the saber-toothed cats are gone, the other lineage still survives, and this is an evolutionary tree of the modern-day cats. And based on the differences in DNA, we estimate that the ancestor of all of today's living cat species occurred about 14 million years ago. And there are today 42 species of cats. The diagram's out of date, where it says 37. And everyone is familiar with the large cats, the big cats, the celebrities of the cat world, leopards, lions, tigers, and so on. But there are only 9 species of big cats, which leaves 33 species of small cats. I think many people are surprised by this, and I'd like to ask how many small species you can think of. I've heard ocelot here, I mentioned the bobcat, I also mentioned the serval. Who can name some other small cat species?
Sandcat.
Sandcat, good one. Pallas? Yes, Pallas's cat, that's a good one. Lynx, yes. Margay, fishing cat. Puma, technically phylogenetically a small cat. You guys are doing better than most audiences. Black-footed cat, now we're getting to the obscure ones. Caracal, all right, you guys did great. A for everyone. But there's some that I bet most of you haven't heard of, like the Ancilla, the marbled cat, the Andean cat, the flat-headed cat, the jungle cat, the rusty-spotted cat, the bay cat, it goes on and on. And so there are lots of little species of cats. They're primarily in Africa and Asia and South America. So there are lots of little species of cats, Most of them are very poorly known, not only to the public, but to scientifically. We really know very little about them. And that leads to the question of which one of them is the ancestor of the domestic cat. Now pretend for a moment I didn't tell you the answer already. But in theory, you could think any of these small cats might have been the ancestor of the domestic cat. And as I've already mentioned, the wild cat is indistinguishable, very similar to domestic cats. And so this was always one of the ideas, that they're derived from the wild cat. And I need to point out, wild cat here is an actual species. It's not just a wild cat. That's the name of the species. It's an unfortunate name, but that is its name. And it's very similar, as you can see, to the domestic cat. So people thought that was the ancestor, but there were other ideas. People had reason to think the sand cat might be the ancestor, or some others. Well, the DNA study confirms what the anatomy suggested. It is the wild cat. And here is part of that evolutionary tree. We look at it closely, and we can see the domestic cat and the wild cat are very closely related. Their DNA is extremely similar. And so I think it's safe to say domestic cats are derived from wild cats. But that only punts the question down the road a little bit, because it turns out there are multiple wild cats. And is it the European wild cat, or the Asian wild cat, or the African wild cat? Well, to settle this question, a researcher named Carlos Driscoll, an American doing his PhD at Oxford, traveled around the world to collect samples of wild cats and of domestic cats around the world. And this photograph here he's visiting some Kazakh eagle hunters in western Mongolia, and that coat is made of 40 Asian wildcat pelts. Now it sounds sad, but I mean, this is how they live. It's a very unforgiving environment, and be that as it may, he not only modeled the coat, but then was able to scrape little bits of tissue from the inside and get a very hard to get sample of the Asian wildcat. So he was able to get samples of all the wildcats from throughout their range, of domestic cats from around the world, and then he built an evolutionary tree. And so here is the tree of the wildcat species. And there were a couple of surprises here. First is that the African wildcat is not one type of cat, but two types. They're genetically quite different between the north and the south. No one had an inkling of this, but the DNA differences suggest that they've been evolving separately for several 100,000 years at least. So that was surprising. The other had to do with this species here, the Chinese mountain cat. This is a gorgeous species, as the name implies, from the mountains of China. And it had long been thought to be closely related to wildcats, but in fact the DNA indicates it is a wildcat, that the Asian wildcat is more similar to the Chinese mountain cat genetically than it is to other ones. So in fact there are five types of wildcats, and we could argue about, some people think they're different species, some people think they're subspecies, and all kinds of different arrangements. It doesn't really matter. There are 5 different types, whatever you call them. Well, from which one did the domestic cat originate? The color shows the 5 different types and where you find them. And there are a couple of possibilities. One is maybe it's the European wildcat, because that does look the most similar to a domestic cat. Maybe it's the North African wildcat. Maybe it's all of them, that many domesticated species today have been domesticated multiple times in different places around the world. Maybe they were domesticated everywhere, and then that's how, and then they all bred together to be one domestic animal. Well, the DNA, the Driscoll study, was very clear on this. It's the North African wildcat. The DNA, there are extremely few DNA differences that consistently distinguish North African wildcats from domestic cats. Many fewer than, for example, that distinguish dogs from wolves. So it's clearly the North African wildcat, and that makes a lot of sense geographically, because part of their range, I should point out it's confusing, they're called the North African wildcat when they occur in Western Asia too, but be that as it may. Part of their distribution is the area that sometimes is called the Fertile Crescent. And that is, as you know, where civilization began, where people first settled down, stopped being hunter-gatherers, and agriculture began, and they had a permanent life, lived in a permanent place. And here's just a drawing of what that might be like. Well, one thing that goes on in places like this, once you start farming, is you grow as much food as you can in the good season, and then you store it for lean times. And undoubtedly, that's what early people did there. And you can imagine what happens when you suddenly have these places full of grain or whatever they're growing. It attracts rodents, rats and mice. And in turn, the idea is That attracted North African wildcats. And we can imagine that all animals, we now realize, differ in personality, just like people do. And you can imagine that we'll be anthropomorphized for a minute, the boldest wildcats, the ones that were the least cautious, would be okay going into the village around the people to take advantage of the ample food supply they would get. And so they ate a lot, and so they could have more kittens. And if this trait was genetically based, the kittens would be more bold as well. And people in turn saw the advantage of having the cats around, so they were nice to them. Maybe they put out a bowl of milk, which would be a terrible idea, but cats will drink it. Or maybe they let them into the hut where it was warm and dry. And in turn, again, the cats most willing to be there would go in and they'd be treated nicely. And then, kittens are adorable, and so people start petting them, and kittens let them do that. And you can imagine that is how domestication occurred. And it's certainly a very plausible scenario, very hard to actually test scientifically, but that could be how cats were domesticated. And a very similar scenario exists for dogs, actually. So a couple of points about domestication. First, I want to define it. And it turns out, if you look it up, there are untold numbers of definitions by academics of domestication. Some of them, enormous definitions. But I think they distill down to the idea that it is the process by which animals and plants are modified by their interactions with humans in a way that benefits us. And the critical point I want to make here is that by modify, I mean they have evolved through genetic changes that result in differences in behavior, physiology, or so on. So that is what is meant by domestication. And it is an evolutionary process, and it's important to realize it is evolution just like species out in the wild. Now, the reason I make a point on this is I do want to emphasize that species that hang around people can evolve, but that doesn't make them domesticated. That all the species up here undoubtedly are evolving in urban areas to whatever traits make them more successful to be around us. But that doesn't make them domesticated. It has to go further than that. And the reason I'm making this point in a moment, will be clear in a moment. Finally, I want one more definition, and that is a tame animal. And a tame animal is an animal that has been raised from a baby and treated kindly, and as a result, lives around people in some degree of harmony. But those animals are biologically no different than wild members of their same species. It's just how they've been raised. And they are not in any way domesticated. And it turns out that many cats, feline species, if you raise them nicely, they'll be tame and make decent pets. Mountain lions, for example, go online, you'll find some videos of mountain lions that seem like they're nice cats. I'm not recommending it, but about 14 different species are tameable, including the African wildcat. But they're not the same as a domesticated animal. You can tame a wolf. I don't recommend it. They're not the friendliest, but they won't eat you. But they're not a wolf. A tame wolf is not a dog. And the reason I made these points is that I want to address the question of where exactly domestication occurred and when. The traditional idea is that it occurred in ancient Egypt, that by about 1500 BC, suddenly cats start showing up on paintings on tomb walls and in carvings and so on. And many of these portrayals clearly indicate that they are domesticated, that they are wearing a collar, they're being fed in a bowl, they sit under the chair, usually of the mistress of the house. Strongly indicated that by 3,500 years ago in Egypt, they have been domesticated. But the question is that where it happened? And there is another contender, and that contender is in Turkey, or near Turkey. And the reason for that idea is twofold. One is the people in Turkey love cats today. And sometimes the capital is referred to as Catstanbul. And if you want to see a delightful documentary, watch this one about Turkish cats and how they're treated in the capital city. But there's a more serious line of evidence, and that comes from the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean near Turkey. And on Cyprus, an archaeological site from 10,000 years ago, some people found this. It's a skeleton of a person about 30 years old. This person was buried with what would likely be treasured objects, polished stones, an axe, and so on. And at this person's feet is this thing here, which you can't really tell it is, what it is, but this diagram shows it's a young cat that has been very carefully laid out, and it's in its own little mini grave, a shallow grave next to the person, suggesting that this was also a valued possession, like the other things, and suggesting that maybe cats were domesticated as much as 10,000 years ago. Oh, and there's one more line of evidence. African wildcats don't occur naturally on Cyprus, and so presumably people brought them over there in the first place. So some people say cats go back 10,000 years, domestic cats. The problem is that you can't tell a tame African wildcat from a domestic cat, certainly not by its skeleton. They're identical. And so we can't know whether this was actually, how far, if any, along the domestication pathway these cats were. So that leaves us unclear where domestication occurred, where or when, somewhere clearly in this region, somewhere between 1500 and 7500 BC. And that's about, at the moment, as far as we can go. There's some people doing some very cool ancient DNA studies to try to shed more light on this, but for now, that's all we know. We do know, however, what happened after this. That very quickly from Egypt, they spread to Greece, from Greece to Rome, and then thanks to the Roman Empire, they spread throughout all of Europe, and then from Europe, they went over to North America, eventually in Australia. And so this is just from the archaeological record, where we see either cat remains or portrayals of cats in these places. Recently, a scientist in Belgium named Claudio Ottoni decided to use ancient DNA methods to try to enhance our understanding of how this happened. And so what he did was he got cat skeletons from archaeological remains from throughout the area. And so this illustration shows where his sites were, the numbers of different sites. You can see they're in Europe, a few in Africa, some in Asia. And this shows the age of them. The only thing I want to point out is across the top, the age. The ones on the far side there go back close to 10,000 years, and the ones on the far right are modern, and so everything in between. So we had cats from a geographically widespread area and through time. And so he was hoping that the DNA would somehow chart the progression of cats out of the Middle East, wherever they came from, just by you could track it genetically, just like people do with humans these days. And so there were lots of fascinating aspects to the study. And when the paper was published, it went viral, but not for the reason I thought. I thought it would go viral due to this: cat mummies. It turns out that the Egyptians made cat mummies by the hundreds of thousands, that they worshipped cats, and yet they slaughtered them in vast quantities to make these mummies that were basically votive offerings that you would take to the temple. And so anyway, there are collections of these in art museums and natural history museums, and Ottoni was able to get DNA out of some of the cat mummies. I thought that's what people would think was spectacular. That was not, however, the viral aspect of it. What was viral was this. Viking cats. And so these memes showed up just all over the place. People love the idea of Viking cats. Where this came from is that one of Ottoni's sites was from the town of Ralsvik, and now in what is northern Germany. But in 700 AD, it was a Viking seaport. And so they got some cat remains, and they looked at the DNA. You would expect from what I told you that the DNA would be similar to those in Central Europe and down to Rome, because that's where we thought they came from. But the DNA associated them with Egyptian cats. And so it suggested that the Vikings had taken their longboats around Europe, through the Mediterranean, picked up some cats. They probably didn't go there to get the cats, but they landed, cats jumped on board, and they brought them back to northern Germany, and that's how they got there. And so that was what people found so fascinating. And then there is the idea that Vikings may have taken cats to many of the islands like Iceland and Greenland, and maybe even North America. The DNA data, he doesn't have data for that. What about in the other direction, into Asia? We know they took two routes. One is the sea route through the Red Sea to India. We know there's a trade route that way, and there's evidence cats spread that way. And then they moved along the Silk Road. And again, using archaeological data, we have a pretty good chronology of how that occurred. The first ones in Pakistan from about 300 BC. 100 years later, they're in India. About the same time they're in China. Finally, they're to Japan in 600 AD. This is, from mostly archaeological finds and paintings and so on. And so that's basically the diaspora of cats around the world. And we thought we had a pretty good handle on it until a few years ago, some scientists reported a shocking discovery. And it came from central China, and it was some cat remains from 3400 BC, 3,000 years earlier than we thought cats got to China. In fact, that's before the cats in Egypt. And so that was a really shocking finding. And moreover, they found them in several different villages in Central Asia. And at least one of them was laid out like the one in Cyprus, very carefully buried, not just thrown into a pit. And moreover, another one of the cats, its teeth were very worn down, so much so that the cat probably could not have survived on its own. And so that suggested, those lines of evidence suggested that these were domestic cats, and they were in China much, much earlier than we thought. Very surprising and confusing. Well, the mystery was resolved a couple years later when a zooarchaeologist compared the bones to wild cats and to other feline species. And what he found was that these were not domestic cats, they were not wild cats, they were a different species at all, entirely, the leopard cat. If you look carefully and squint, you can see differences in the back part of the jaw, what's called the condyle, and they're different shapes, and that apparently is quite diagnostic. And so what they were was the Asian leopard cat, a gorgeous species found throughout much of Asia today. And in some ways, it wouldn't be surprising that the Asian leopard cat, people tried to domesticate them, because today they're found in agricultural fields. Occasionally they come into villages, not as much as the African wildcat. And they're in palm oil plantations, so they're around people. So it's plausible that someone might have tried to domesticate them at some point. On the other hand, there's one reason that they have been surprising, and that is the behavior of the Asian leopard cat and its tameability. As one person called them, they are a foul-tempered little beast with a gorgeous spotted coat. In other words, they make terrible pets, and they don't tame down very well, and just doesn't, in that way, seem like a good candidate to domestication. So, as with the one in Cyprus, we don't know, were these tame leopard cats, or had they started to be domesticated? We don't know. But then they disappear. There's no more evidence of them. What happened? We don't know. One possibility is the African wildcat. When it arrived there, it kicked them out because the African wildcats are much nicer, or the domestic cats derived from African wildcats. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe the leopard cat experiment just died out on its own. We don't know. But you have to feel, I think, sorry for the leopard cat. It missed its chance at greatness. I mean, think about the domestic cat is one of the two most abundant mammalian carnivores in the world today. And that could have been the Asian leopard cat. But don't feel too sorry for them, because they have gotten their revenge. And here is the revenge of the leopard cat. It started in the 1960s when a woman living in Southern California named Jean Mill bought a leopard cat in a pet store. And apparently back then, you could just buy one in a pet store. Now, why you would do that is another question. I've told you they make crummy pets, but she bought one, and she thought it was lonely, so she put it in a cage with a tomcat she had. And they bred, and they had kittens, which is surprising in its own respect, because these are two species that are separated by about 6 million years of divergent evolution. You would not expect them to be able to interbreed and produce offspring, but they did. And that was the basis of a new breed that was created by continually breeding those hybrids to female domestic cats. And the reason they had to do females is that the male hybrids were not fertile for many generations. But they could breed the females to domestic cats, and they've created this, the Bengal. Arguably the most beautiful cat, a breed of cat today, arguably more beautiful than the Asian leopard cat. It is a spectacular looking cat that has become one of the most popular breeds of cats in the world. And these are very energetic cats. They have a lot of wild energy in them, although they're only about genetically 4% leopard cat due to all the back crossing. But they're very popular cats, and importantly, they're also very friendly cats, because the breeders have not only selected for beautiful looks, but for a friendly disposition. And so they've gotten rid of that mean demeanor and made them into very nice house cats. Now, they're not lap cats. That's what people tell me very clearly. They're not going to sit in your lap, but you can see that that you can pet them on their own terms. So the Asian leopard cat has had its day after all, and the Bengal is around. Well, finally, a few last words about the future of cats. And one thing, if I had more time, I would tell you about is the sequencing of the genome of the cats, which has been led by a colleague of mine at the University of Missouri, just down the road from me, named, appropriately enough, Leslie Lyons. And they're making remarkable discoveries about the genome of cats, just as going on with dogs, and it's important for the health of cats and helping to solve genetic diseases of cats, and has been useful in many other ways. And I'd be happy to tell you more about that later. But I want to ask a different question, and that is, are feral cats evolving? Because there are cats all around the world today living independently. I'm not talking about cats living, outside and being fed by people, but cats living out in the wilderness, truly on their own wits. And they occur in a wide variety of different habitats. In Australia, for example, you can find them in the blazing hot part of the continent, in the outback. You can find them on high mountains in New Zealand, and also Tasmania, also in New Zealand. They occur on oceanic islands in the Pacific where they eat large prey that they don't eat anywhere else. Now, one of the most exciting developments in evolutionary biology, I think in the last 20 or 30 years, is the realization that when organisms experience new environments, they can evolve very rapidly. And some of the wonderful faculty here in UBC, such as Dolph, have been leaders in documenting that. I would be shocked if feral cat populations in the outback or in high mountains are not adapting to their new circumstances. Surprisingly, no one has studied this, and this is something that I'm starting to study to see if it is happening. And well, as a scientist, you shouldn't say that you're sure that they are, but I am sure they are. But we don't have any evidence. But there is one particularly tantalizing piece of evidence, and it has to do with this animal here, the black leopard, which is sometimes called the black panther. It is a melanistic or black member of the leopard species. It's just a single mutation that causes them to be black. And populations of leopards where this is common tend to live in forests where it's dark. And in fact, melanism occurs in 14 different species of felines, and almost all of them live in forests. And it's very rare in species that live out in the open. Well, this photograph was taken by a trail camera in Madagascar about 10 years ago. It's an odd-looking black cat that the local people call the Fidowati. And when it was first photographed, scientists thought that it might be a new species of cat, that it hadn't been detected. So they caught one and they sampled its DNA, and it's just a domestic cat. But the important point is it lives deep in the forest in Madagascar. And so it suggests that it is adapting to this forest by evolving black coloration. And so the first thing we're going to look at is variation in color in domestic cat populations in forests and deserts and so on. And I can tell you the early results are, in fact, they are much more commonly black in forested areas. But of course, there are many other ways that domestic cats may be adapting to living in the wild. Certainly physiologically to hot, dry areas like deserts or cold, wet areas like mountains. And so that's, I think, a topic well worth investigating. I want to end finally by talking about the deep future of cats. And as we all know, we're making a real mess of the environment right now. But we can hope that eventually we'll stop and there will be some nature left and it will recover. It'll take a while. And the question is, will there be cats then? Tigers and ocelots, we can hope they'll be there. Will they? I don't know. But we can be sure that one feline will be around, and that feline is the domestic cat. By some estimates, there may be 1 billion cats in the world today. They are on every continent of Antarctica. Probably only a quarter of those cats are pet cats. The rest are living out in the wild. And if there's any nature left in the future, domestic cats will be there. Oh, and I said all these things. So we can look perhaps for inspiration by what's happened historically. When the first spotted small cat entered South America 3 million years ago, well, it very quickly gave rise to 8 species that occur there today. Or going back a little further in time, when Proilurus evolved 30 million years ago, well, these are all the living species that have resulted from it today, quite varied and very different. I would like to think that sometime in the future, we might have to wait a few tens of thousands of years or millions. The domestic cat could give rise to another radiation of cats that would be equally as diverse. Maybe we'll get saber-toothed cats back. But I think in that sense, there is a hope that there will be cats on the world as long as there is a world. That's a hopeful statement. And with that, we should celebrate National Cat Day.